is Adam Mcclellan. I'm a trader for Red Fox Coffee Merchants. And I guess technically I'm also the Mexico sourcing and sales lead. And I say trader, but we're a small company, and mostly that it just involves sales and maintaining relationships with roasters. So yeah, and I live in Portland, Oregon, most of the year, and half the year I'm in Mexico as well.
Do you want to talk a little bit about like who Red Fox is and how you guys operate? Because you're a little different than most kind of traditional importers.
Yeah, well, we're a small family business, really, and that a lot of our competitors or people that I think traditionally occupy the space of importers are pretty large companies typically. Not always, but generally speaking, that's kind of like, when you're working in the middle of the supply chain for, tropical imported goods, it kind of falls into the whole commodity trading. And we're just a super focused small company working in not every origin of coffee, just a handful of origins, and primarily working with smallholder farmers that are in really remote places that haven't really been able to access the highest end of the specialty coffee market in terms of like consumers and roasters. So we put a lot of investment into kind of building out the supply chains and developing long-term relationships in those communities and working with those suppliers and smallholder farmers there.
Cool. Do you also want to kind of explain a little bit the whole concept of, I think you called them bespoke blends, and kind of these like kind of smaller boutique kind of micro blends you guys are assembling?
Kind of a big part of what defines us is just, the quality that we're able to bring in. And that involves like, just a ton of cupping samples, because a smallholder farmer may deliver 60 kilos of parchment at one point, or they may deliver 100 kilos or 500 kilos. It's depending on the origin and the farmer, but that doesn't all necessarily happen at once. So what we like to do is cup everything completely separated as much as possible in order to kind of get a sense for the quality of the harvest from each farmer in each area. And a lot of times, some of the better qualities, it's too small to really separate out. And then sometimes it's like the quality is really standard in one community and it's really, really good, but not necessarily something that a roaster might feature as a single origin coffee. It might, factor into a blend. So we kind of create what we call community bulks or community lots, based on kind of a super specific, beyond like a state or a department or region, but an actual like kind of community or village that is all growing in the same area and similar profile coffee. So we kind of like to build those blends at origin with our quality control and cupping team. And then that's kind of what we keep separated out. It's a high touch business. We have a lot of our containers that come in have a lot of different separated contracts and lots inside those containers. So it definitely requires a lot of attention to detail at origin at the point of, when we're going to construct those blends, giving the right instructions to the mills, and then multiple sampling throughout that before the coffee is even exported, just to make sure that things are kind of where we want it to be from a quality standpoint, because that also in turn defines how much we're paying the producers. We buy usually 3, sometimes even 4 different tiers of quality in most places. Our sourcing team is responsible for kind of putting those together and then tracking the shipment into port of destination and getting into the warehouses in the US and Canada and other countries as well.
So, I mean, it sounds like you guys are hyper involved kind of with every touch point along that journey.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot too, right? So like, in Peru, for example, like way out in Cusco, it's, that coffee, we're approving a sample when it's still, let's say in the Incahuasi Valley, that's 10 hours from the main town where the coffee is eventually going to be stored. So we'll cup a sample and we'll say, all right, we can move these coffees to that warehouse there. And that's a 10-hour truck drive. And then, till they get to the dry mill in Lima, it's another 12 to 15 hours. And we're kind of keeping track of that the whole way. At the point where it gets to the dry mill in Lima, we have someone present at all times during the milling. And then we have someone fully dedicated to making bookings on shipping lines at origin and always kind of staying on top of that and working with shippers and cooperatives to get the best possible routing and stuff like that. So, I mean, I've worked for other importing companies. I've worked for a roasting company in the green, and our time and interest in monitoring every point is more than I've ever been a part of,
No, I mean, I think it shows through and final product. We pursue a lot of like single farm coffees, and especially ones where there's any kind of communication relationship available. And a huge part of that is, we're a small company. So if we can talk with the producer, and if the producer is kind of the one being mindful, then we can at least get a little bit more assurance that coffees are moving through those quality checkpoints. But when you get into these kind of smaller scale producers, if there's not an entity that's like really monitoring that stuff, it's just hard to know what's happening. Peru is kind of your older kind of base operations, right? And then Mexico is a more recent origin that you guys started working in?
Yeah, I think for Red Fox, when Aleko Chigunis, the founder of Red Fox, kind of had a vision for what the business could be, I really think Peru is what inspired him most and kind of what drove him to establish, the supply chains basically. I mean, Colombia was kind of like I think our original origin that we bought in, probably Ethiopia as well. But Peru kind of just like had all this unlocked potential, but it definitely needed people to spend time at origin and to make those long trips out to those communities and really talk with the farmers and kind of get buy-in on the behalf of those co-ops. So Peru, I would say, has definitely been the fastest growing and has seen the most response in the market, and is also the first country where we invested in putting in an office, an actual physical office, and a team of people there to kind of like help run the operation. And that's only grown in the last 4 or 5 years. So and then Mexico is now the second origin where we have an office and a cupping lab and a team of people on the ground.
So it sounds like you were kind of one of the ones that were instrumental in structuring that. Is that accurate, right?
Yeah. I think, when I joined Red Fox, I think a big part of my interest in working with them was that Mexico was sort of this origin that had a lot of history in the specialty market, but wasn't really recognized, I don't think, for quality. And so I was excited to be able to bring sort of what I thought Mexico could be to the table, basically, and spend some time there. So I was traveling a bunch and initiated a lot of new relationships that we're still purchasing from to this day. And it was 6 years ago now, I guess. And then 2 years ago is when we started seeing a good response from the market. Every year, a little bit of growth. And so it made sense for us to kind of look to put in an office last year. So actually in 2019, I spent a couple of months looking for an office space, literally just like walking around Oaxaca City and trying to find the right space for us. And it's definitely been a super rewarding part of my job, is being able to help build the program for us down there and, make sort of that dream become a reality. The last couple of years, it's been exciting.
When we were first getting into coffees and fair trade being the thing that we looked to is like, oh, okay, this is how we work ethically with producers. And it seemed like that was really coming out of Mexico and the all these co-ops that were formed, since we've grown a lot in our understanding of how we work with producers. But it also seems like the structure of co-ops, or the faith in co-ops, has kind of really shifted in a big way.
Yeah, Mexico is interesting because, it's really where fair trade started, even as a concept. How Mexico is known in the specialty market up to the last 5 years was primarily for certified coffees that were all kind of blended and bulked, and was really a known origin for fair trade and organic coffees that came into the market. But I don't think the reputation for quality was really there. I would say, there's actually a really big difference between Chiapas and Oaxaca as well. I think, and even maybe Veracruz, each of those are the three main kind of producing states in Mexico. And each one is really different and distinct in how they kind of operate. And I'd say the co-ops in Chiapas have actually been really successful and still are, and produce really good quality. I think they kind of have a really good system down. The farmers there are slightly larger in terms of how much land they each farm and own, which I think allows a better level of profitability operating through a cooperative structure. In Oaxaca specifically, the idea of kind of everybody selling into the co-op at a base level and getting kind of the same price. The co-ops grew so much, I don't think it always did a really good service to the farmers. The profitability wasn't really the same equation as it is in other areas and certainly other origins. But as the origin of fair trade, it started growing and growing and growing, and then you got these co-ops that are multi-tiered and even have their own, they operate their own banks, and they kind of controlled the market. but they didn't really ever seek out the evolution, where the market was going. Roasters such as yourself that were looking for quality, were willing to pay for good quality. And I think that the fair trade kind of just like stayed in a linear way and didn't really, in a meaningful way, provide access for their farmers to a higher paying, market, aside from maybe entering a few samples in auctions and things like that.
Right.
That was more, marketing than anything, than actual real, I think, results. So there are still a couple of operating co-ops in Oaxaca these days, but for the most part, the farmers have all kind of fractured. The smaller community level associations that made up part of the larger co-ops have kind of started out seeking their own buyers, their own commercial relationships, and which is part of the challenge, talking about like communicating pricing and shipping and all these things, and talking about taking parchment to green, you know what I mean? Like in the milling and all that stuff, a co-op is certainly able to manage all that communication really well. That's what they do. But then you get a smallholder association that's trying to catch up to all that and understand all that. And it's a bit of a challenge. I believe the best quality is in Oaxaca in Mexico, but to actually get it out, because for so long it's just been blended in bulk. So, I guess taking a step back a little bit, of these bigger co-ops, what they would do is buy from multiple different regions in Oaxaca, and then just mix it all at the point in the mill, different altitudes, different communities. So you kind of lose all the like distinct flavors of the terroirs of the state. That really does, there's a really big difference in like Pluma compared to like Santiago Atitlán or La Cañada. The cup profiles are really distinct and different. And so that's been a big thing for us, is showing roasters in the market the variety of coffees that exist, and cup profiles, and in just Oaxaca alone, that we're able to kind of separate out working with these communities.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe that's a nice way to pivot into talking more specifically about the coffee we're buying from you guys this year, which is the Santiago Atitlán.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk kind of specifically about what it was like working with that area?
Well, actually, I started buying coffee from that area in the second year buying in Oaxaca in 2016 or 17. It didn't quite come in as we wanted it to. That area has a lot of challenges. It's being in the northern part of the state of Oaxaca. It actually is influenced a ton by weather coming off the Gulf of Mexico, whereas all the coffees in like the Sierra Sur and the Mixteca of Oaxaca, it's all from the Pacific. So you have a much more distinct rainy and dry season. Whereas in the Northern Sierra, it kind of rains all year long. There's a lot more moisture in the air, and so it makes it harder to dry. Ripening is sort of much slower. So I don't know if I wrote it off totally, but I sort of, after a couple of deliveries that just weren't that exciting, the coffee didn't come in that great. But this past year, some of the premiums that we pay also go to agronomists and technicians that can help communities. So we sent one up to Mixteca, but the same agronomist that we sent to Mixteca last year let us know about this community that he had been working with, which is Santiago Atitlán. He was like, will you be interested in samples? We said, of course, we'd love to taste it and see what's going on there. And then he's like, well, I'll just bring the farmers to your office. So he brought this group of, I think it was like 7 or 8 of them to our office, and just had a long discussion on what we were looking for and what the quality was. And I didn't honestly think much was going to come out of it.
Were they receptive or what?
Yeah, they were receptive. They were excited about it. Also part of the challenge of working with Oaxaca is that these are indigenous communities that each have their own language. So we're communicating in Spanish, but that's their second language as well. And I think sometimes I'm not really sure the level of detail that we're talking about in terms of like, taking moisture readings and talking about 100-point scores in a cup and things like that.
A lot gets lost in communication.
Yeah, so you're not really sure. Yeah, and I felt like the conversation was really positive. They were definitely eager to like get us some samples, but then a month later, the samples started showing up, and honestly, they were the best we had cupped of the harvest so far this past year. And I think what actually came in is probably some of the best coffees from the whole country. So that was really encouraging, and we made a couple of visits up there, and the farmers kept sending more samples. I think the interesting thing about that, that region, as I said, the ripening is slower, so the harvest isn't necessarily all at once. They would get like a little bit at a time, and then bring down maybe around 10 to 15 bags worth at a time. And then like towards the end of the harvest in like April, a couple of them were like, hey, we have a couple of lots left. And this one guy showed up too with a sample of geisha from his farm.
Sure.
So it's like all these surprises kept coming up from it, and it
Yeah.
was yeah, it was just really interesting how they, how they kind of responded and organized themselves. Like, we're not at a point yet where we own our own trucks and things like that. And I think a big part of
Right.
like how coffee gets traded in Oaxaca, the farmers expect somebody that shows up with a truck, some cash in hand, and tells
Right.
them, this is your price. We're going to take everything. This is the
Right.
price of coffee. It's kind of like the coyote model with a lot of the multinationals there. We had to explain to them, look, we are a specialty focused business. It's all about quality. We love the samples you sent us, but you got to bring the coffee to Oaxaca, to this warehouse and the dry mill that we're using there, so we can sample it again and make sure that the quality checks out. You weren't just kind of like giving us a nicely selected sample, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because we have to mitigate our own risk. And they really understood that, and they organized and reluctantly got a truck and brought down their parchment. And then once they saw that we paid them right away, they kept bringing more
Sure.
truckloads down and got organized. And so, yeah, it's encouraging to see when a community that's like loosely organized, not at all officially organized, are able to kind of work together and encourage their neighbors and family members that are also farming coffee to submit samples and bring the coffee down. So yeah, that was a really gratifying, results this year, I thought, and excited to see where that can go. Hopefully we get a lot
Yeah.
more
Well, I
volume.
guess two questions from there. One, did they do anything different this year, or did like just the stars align?
Well, I mean, I think the results of working with an agronomist and technician, which a lot of these
It goes a
communities
long
have
way.
never had anybody go up there and talk to them about why pick ripe cherry. If the way that this
Sure.
works is like the buyer comes up and says, this is my price, why would I not just kind of pick everything? Hearing from the agronomist technician guy that went up there, that the only way they're able to like maybe look at getting higher prices is if they only select ripe cherry. And I think also like being really conscientious about how the coffee gets dried.
Well, that was my second question: is how are they dealing with that? Are they doing like greenhouses or mechanical dryers or?
No mechanical dryers. They're only doing primarily patio drying still. I
Mhm.
think the goal is to build some kind of like hoop house style covered drying beds up there. But they basically just, rather than as in the past, maybe leaving the coffee out as the rains were coming, take it back
They're
in.
covering stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're covering it, and just, being more conscious about like once it's dry, stays dry kind of thing. But I also think they played around a little bit with fermentation. A big kind of trend there is doing sort of this, anaerobic or fermentation in buckets with a seal on it. So I think a handful of them did that based on what they were telling us. So I definitely think that had a big contribution to making the cups like taste really stand out a bit more. They'll pick the cherry,
Sure.
let it sit in the bucket for like 24 hours, then depulp and then cover it again and ferment it like that. So I think
Nice.
taking some extra sort of deliberate steps in the processing and drying really help them get some consistent
And
products.
that was a recommendation from your technician, or that's just something they did like intuitively?
Yeah, it was a recommendation from the agronomist. Yep. Yeah. So it paid off in the first year. It doesn't always,
Yeah,
but
the coffee, I mean, what we got from you guys this year is really, really wonderful. You sent us, I don't remember how many samples, 4 or 5 samples or whatever. But that one was the one that was like, oh my God, this is like
yeah.
really exciting coffee.
Yeah, no, we were like, people were talking about like, Colombia like profile, even some Kenya like notes, just those really big, bright, blackberry currant type flavors. Super sweet, really clean coffee.
Another question that was kind of coming to mind. You're talking about how it's a loosely organized community. You guys are trying to establish kind of deeper roots in the community. Is it challenging forming kind of longer purchasing relationships when you don't have that specific structure in place, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a process of trust. What we have to do now is back up what we did this year, so if they can deliver the same quality, we pay the same prices. And I think once we establish that with the community, it really shows them that we're for real, you know what I mean? And it wasn't just like a one-off. A lot of farmers, they hear buyers going up and talking about prices, but then they never actually really see those prices. So it's a huge part. And, I'm not trying to call people out or name names. I don't know what happens necessarily, but I hear that from farmers all the time, that so-and-so buyer came up there, talked about these prices, but then they never actually saw the premiums make it to the community. So, I mean, it's a lot of work, honestly, to track that over individual farmers. And you're talking a community of 30 to 40 farmers that are each delivering their own parchment and tracking the weights that they delivered and their cup scores and then that premium. So it's really, really important to us that when we agree to a price with them, we pay that. And with them, we were luckily able to figure out, some financing off, right off the bat for them and pay them right away rather than have them wait, which is sometimes has to happen to the point of export when we actually pay for the coffee, they get paid. But in this case, we were able to work with a local financer to get them paid right away as soon as the coffee came down and checked out. So I think that spoke volumes right away. And that's why we started seeing more samples come through. And so, yeah, I really think it's a lot about trust because they've been in positions where, unfortunately, like the price of coffee is still too cheap. And our, consuming culture as something that's sort of like, people see it as something that's ubiquitous and cheap, but like there's a ton of work that goes into it from these men and women that are farming coffee in these really remote, difficult conditions, and it should cost a lot more. And so I think they know that, right? And they feel that deeply that their product is worth so much more because of what they put into it. They've been screwed over so many times by, being without a position of power to like actually negotiate better prices. So I think building trust is just such a huge part. And that just is like doing what you say you're going to do, which surprisingly doesn't happen that often. It seems so simple, but, our company is based in the US, but we try to have a really local presence so that if they have questions or they need help right away, like me and my colleagues' phones are blowing up constantly every day. It's like texting and calls. And they, those guys from Atilan, they made the most visits. We were getting weekly visits from them to our office in Oaxaca just to like check in and say hi. And it's like, we're here, you know what I mean? So I think for them that like to have access to the end buyer like that, is a big deal.
That was going to be one of my other questions is how many, like, what's your team look like in country there?
Part of our sourcing team, which is half of it's based in Peru. So Ali Newcombe is our director of sourcing. She's wonderful and does incredible work. She's based in Lima, but spent, I think at least 3 months, maybe a little bit more in Oaxaca this year. And she kind of handles, the higher level admin, working on, organizing all the approvals and all of the, which samples go into which lots, go to which instructions at the dry mill, and making sure that's all kind of followed to a T to the point of export. Karina Barreda, who's also based in Lima, came up for a couple of months and helps out a lot with the quality control and knows about the work in the dry mill. I would say, the biggest force for us in not only in Mexico, now in Colombia as well, but is Fabian Viveros. And he's Colombian, but has lived in Oaxaca for 5 years now. And we hired him a few years ago. And yeah, he's got a ton of energy. He's the son of a coffee farming family from Huila, Colombia. And so really can kind of like, speak the language of a coffee farmer and really gets like what their needs are. And also provides incredible advice to a lot of the farmers in Mexico that have never had really anybody tell them how to do stuff differently. So he's a huge, huge part of our team there. And then we have some people in the lab as well. We're actually going to be hiring this year in Mexico a few positions in terms of like building up the team more to spend more time in the field. So that's probably an agronomist and then somebody that helps in the cupping lab and another liaison between the communities and our office there. So we're trying to build up the team a lot and bring different levels of expertise and experience to the team. So
you had talked about how part of the issue is that you're dealing with such small farms in the area. What's the average farm size?
Most farmers in Oaxaca have about 2 hectares on average, which are split between 2 different plots. If they have extended family, they each have a couple of hectares as well. So it's kind of cool to be able to work, with a family that's instant trust and, organization built into those family units. So if your brother is telling you, hey, we found this buyer, we're going to sell them some coffee, it makes a lot more sense. So, but honestly, yeah, it's really small. And the, the age of a lot of the coffee trees in Oaxaca is pretty old. So productivity is not high.
Are people stumping plants there, or are they just kind of letting them run?
In some cases, yeah. I mean, leaf rust hit hard in 2014.
That was another 15. One of my questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was really vulnerable, susceptible kind of conditions. Many had just abandoned their farms, but ones that
Yeah.
wanted to continue farming did some stumping, did some replanting. Some of them started incorporating new varieties, but a big problem in Mexico that I've seen is that there's people trying to hand out varieties, but they don't tell them how to manage it, or like
Mhm.
what, or like how it's going to taste, And so I think there's skepticism in terms of like planting a variety that they say will be resistant, but they're not sure how it's going to react. So
I've gotten to interface a little bit with co-ops and farms in Colombia, and it seems like that's like a really well structured government agency. Is there just not governmental support?
and not at all. There was in the 80s. And then when there was a market crash and the whole organization kind of just went away.
Yeah.
But there was, decent support and there was some commitment to just purchase like the FNC has. Yeah, in terms of like being able to help farmers with technical assistance and all that. There's really nobody. It's kind of everyone's left to their own devices. And some cases, the co-ops try to fill that void a little bit. In Chiapas, the nurseries that the co-ops manage and distribute for free or for a really low price to their members, the new plants is incredible. And they're
Right.
composting plants there, some really high quality compost that they're able to distribute to their farmers. And the nurseries are really big and it's all organic, And so, yeah, Chiapas, the way that the co-ops have been able to kind of fill that void is impressive.
Mm,
Oaxaca, I haven't seen that as much. There's just
mm.
been people that show up and say, here, plant these varieties, but, farmers are skeptical of that. And I think some of them have heard about the geisha stuff and heard that it gets a higher price. So they're
That
planting
stuff's so
that.
dangerous. Oh, I heard this one thing is trending. I think roasters tend to act really irresponsibly with how they make
Yeah.
recommendations for like high risk decisions like that.
Yeah,
Uh,
totally. And we have to be really careful about that as well. I think a
right.
lot of times, like I said, we hired an agronomist last year to go up to a couple of the communities, but we are like when I go up, I'm like, and they ask me what to plant or what to buy, I sort of say right away, like I'm not an agronomist. This isn't my area of expertise. Typically, we have a higher percentage of approving the varieties that you have, like Bourbon and Typica, and we want to pay you a lot more for them to make that their lower productivity more worth it.
Right.
But I think, farmers should make their own decisions. Yeah, I don't tell them like there's no one variety that's going to be your magic ticket,
Right. Right.
I think that in a lot of cases it makes a lot of sense for them to work with what they know if they're not getting
Sure.
the technical assistance. And
Sure.
so work with what they know works well in that land. And under the shade, because a lot of them aren't willing to get rid of their shade. And I actually appreciate that. I think looking at and the coffee in the context of climate change these days, like coffee farms in Oaxaca are actually and Chiapas certainly are playing a big role in protecting the forest, and
Right.
forest canopy and things like that, because they're grown under such, forested conditions, which coffee, traditionally likes. It's a lot like Ethiopia, where it's just kind of a really natural habitat for it. Bourbon and Typica, more so Bourbon, I think, responds really well to those kinds of practices that
Right.
I think it in some cases makes a lot of sense for them to at least maintain some of that variety and maybe experiment with a little bit of other stuff. But yeah, I think a big part of why I love working in Mexico is the cup profiles that we taste there like don't really exist in other places because of the varieties, and
Yeah.
I think that's really special about it is we're kind of getting this glimpse into a variety driven flavor profile that almost doesn't exist anywhere else in the world.
I feel like I could keep asking you lots of questions here, but maybe that's a good spot to end there is maybe if you just want to kind of describe why are Oaxacan coffees specifically so exciting for you and what do you feel like those taste like that are unique versus other origins?
The range of cup profile in Oaxaca is so big, and I find that like really encouraging to be able to go to like the La Cañada, Santiago Atitlan, Pluma, and Sierra Sur, La Mixteca, and you're getting really distinct flavors out of that, and that that really drives us forward is to be able to like bring those to market, right? And I think the coffee that you have, the Santiago Atlan, was kind of a surprise this year. I didn't think we would get a profile like that at Oaxaca, to be honest. La Cañada, that's also Sierra Norte, has some of the similar growing conditions, but there's a ton of tropical fruit flavors that come out of those coffees. Really exciting and dynamic flavor profiles. And then the Mixteca, it's just like that kind of coffee that everyone wants to drink all day. It's a classic coffee flavor without being like heavy. So I sort of think of like Colombian coffee as being very classic, but have a bigger, heavier profile, maybe. The Mexican and particularly the Oaxacan coffees are just like, they're so easy to drink. They just go right down. They're almost refreshing in terms of like their acidity and like the sweetness and kind of like lightness of them. They're
Yeah.
like a light body, classic flavor coffee that honestly is what most people just want to drink every day. I mean, what we've seen is like, this type of profile is generally what people respond to, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I think to be able to like, to continue separating and finding new, new communities in Oaxaca and separating those coffees and bringing them to market is really, and paying farmers correctly and being able to do that follow up to make sure that premiums are making it into the hands of farmers is definitely like, inspires me to keep this pushing forward. And it's definitely why Red Fox is there, and I expect us to grow a lot. We're seeing a really good response from roasters that's encouraging. So to see us actually being able to execute at origin, it's really gratifying so far.